In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in that endless conflict, sometimes the most horrifying outcomes emerge not from grand strategic calculations or ancient prophecies, but from the chaotic collision of two fundamentally incompatible forces meeting in the most unexpected ways. Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing yet bizarrely fascinating scenarios that the Warhammer 40,000 universe can conjure. What happens when the galaxy's most enthusiastic looters encounter one of its most rage-filled killing machines? What happens when Orks capture a Berserker Dreadnought? This isn't just a question about mechanics or tactics. This is a deep dive into the collision of two philosophies of violence, two completely different approaches to warfare, and two utterly alien mindsets that share only one common ground: an insatiable appetite for destruction. On one side, we have the Berserker Dreadnought, a walking tomb of ceramite and adamantium that imprisons a WH40K warrior so consumed by rage and madness that even death couldn't release him from his endless crusade of slaughter. On the other, we have the Orks, a species for whom war isn't just a means to an end, but the end itself, a joyous celebration of violence that defines their entire existence. What makes this scenario particularly compelling is that it represents a clash not just of armies or ideologies, but of fundamental realities. The Berserker Dreadnought exists in a state of perpetual torment, its pilot a Chaos Space Marine who has been denied even the mercy of death, trapped in a mechanical prison that amplifies his rage while driving him deeper into madness with each passing moment. The Orks, by contrast, approach war with something approaching glee, their entire culture built around the simple joy of a good scrap. When these two forces meet, when Ork ingenuity and enthusiasm collide with Khornate fury and chaos corruption, the results defy easy prediction. To understand what happens in this collision, we need to examine both components in detail. We need to understand what a Berserker Dreadnought truly is, what drives the Orks to loot everything they can get their green hands on, and how their unique psychic abilities interact with technology. We need to explore the mechanics of Ork looting, the horror of chaos corruption, and the strange alchemy that occurs when the WAG energy field meets warp-tainted machinery. Only then can we truly appreciate the nightmare scenario that unfolds when these two forces intersect. This is a journey into the darkest and strangest corners of the 41st millennium, where tragedy meets absurdity, where horror becomes farce, and where the very laws of reality seem to bend under the weight of accumulated violence and madness. This is the story of what happens when the unstoppable force of Ork enthusiasm meets the immovable object of Khornate rage, all wrapped up in several tons of corrupted adamantium and blessed with far too much daka. The Berserker Dreadnought, a prison of rage and metal. Before we can understand what the Orks do to a Berserker Dreadnought, we need to understand exactly what this terrifying war machine represents. A Berserker Dreadnought isn't simply a piece of military hardware, or even just another Chaos Space Marine variant. It is, in the truest sense, a living nightmare made manifest in steel and ceramite. The lineage of these horrific machines traces back to the Horus heresy itself, when the World Eaters Legion, already known for their savage reputation and the neurological implants called the Butcher's Nails that drove them to ever greater heights of violence, began modifying their Contemptor Dreadnoughts for a very specific purpose. These modifications weren't about increasing firepower or improving armor, though both were certainly enhanced. No, these changes were about creating the ultimate close combat weapon, a line breaker that could smash through enemy formations with the unstoppable momentum of pure, undiluted rage. The Berserker Dreadnoughts that emerged from these modifications were larger and swifter than their standard counterparts, optimized for suicidal charges straight into the heart of enemy positions. But the true horror of these machines wouldn't be fully realized until after the heresy, when the traitor legions fell completely under the sway of the Chaos Gods. For the World Eaters, this meant total dedication to Khorne, the blood god, the Lord of Skulls, the entity that exists as the personification of rage, violence, and bloodshed in the Imperium. Modern Berserker Dreadnoughts, and their degraded cousins the Hellbrutes, represent the absolute nadir of what was once the honored tradition of Dreadnought internment. When a Space Marine suffers catastrophic injuries that would kill any normal human, but their spirit burns too brightly to be lost, they can be interred within a Dreadnought sarcophagus. For Loyalist chapters, this is considered a great honor, a way for a fallen hero to continue serving the Emperor even after their mortal flesh has failed them. The warrior becomes a living relic, a repository of ancient wisdom and battlefield experience that can be awakened when the chapter has need of their service. For Chaos Space Marines, and particularly those dedicated to Khorne, this process becomes something altogether different and infinitely more terrible. The sarcophagus doesn't just preserve life, it amplifies every sensation of pain and rage. The pilot doesn't drift in honored sleep between battles. They endure waking nightmares of unfulfilled bloodlust and unending fury. The machine doesn't just respond to their thoughts. It feeds on their madness, growing stronger as the pilot descends deeper into insanity. The process of creating a Hellbrute is itself a form of torture. The mortally wounded Chaos Space Marine is bound into an amniotic sarcophagus using pseudo-parasitic machinery that fuses their nervous system with the combat walker's control systems. Unlike the relatively clean integration of Loyalist Dreadnoughts, this connection is invasive, aggressive, and deliberately painful. The warp-tainted technology doesn't just interface with the pilot's mind, it invades it, corrupting and twisting their perceptions until the line between man and machine becomes so blurred as to be meaningless. For a Berserker Dreadnought specifically, this process is even more extreme. These pilots are already consumed by the butcher's nails or similar neural modifications, their brains rewired to experience pleasure only through violence and pain through the absence of combat. Now imagine that consciousness trapped in a metal shell, denied the visceral satisfaction of feeling their chain axe bite into enemy flesh, unable to experience the warmth of spraying blood or the crack of breaking bones under their own hands. They can kill, yes, but only at a remove, filtered through mechanical sensors and servo arms that translate the physical reality of slaughter into cold data streams. This denial of sensation, combined with the endless waiting between deployments, drives these pilots to the very edge of sanity and then pushes them far beyond it. They become creatures of pure rage, beings that exist only to kill, and for whom even killing brings no real satisfaction. Between battles, the sarcophagus containing the pilot is often disconnected and chained in dark chambers, where the Chaos Space Marine within seethes in impotent fury, their minds slowly dissolving under the weight of accumulated hatred and the corrupting influence of chaos. The physical form of a Berserker Dreadnought reflects this inner torment. Where Loyalist Dreadnoughts maintain the clean lines and noble bearing of Imperial design, Berserker Dreadnoughts are twisted mockeries of their former selves. Spikes of brass and bone protrude from their armor plating, inscribed with the runes of Khorne that seem to writhe and pulse with barely contained violence. Chains hang from their chassis, both functional restraints and symbolic reminders of their bondage to the blood god. Their armor is stained with the accumulated bloodshed of centuries, layers upon layers of dried gore that forms a grotesque patina over the ceramite and adamantium. The weapons they carry are similarly corrupted. Power fists become massive claws dripping with demonic energy. Assault cannons transform into roaring instruments of murder that hunger for ammunition as a starving man hungers for food. Even their close combat weapons, enormous chain blades and power hammers larger than a grown man, seem to possess a malevolent awareness, as if the machinery itself has been infected by the pilot's rage. Inside the sarcophagus, what remains of the Space Marine is barely recognizable as human. The warp's influence has twisted their flesh, fusing muscle to metal and bone to circuitry in ways that defy any rational understanding of biology or engineering. The amniotic fluid that should sustain them is often tinged with blood, either from the constant low-level damage their body suffers from the invasive connections, or from their own rage-induced attempts to claw their way free of their prison. Their mind, what's left of it, exists in a state of constant fury, a screaming vortex of hatred and bloodlust that can never be fully sated. This is the being, the consciousness, the tortured amalgamation of man and machine and demon that the Orks will encounter when they manage to capture a Berserker Dreadnought. This is the prison of rage that they'll attempt to crack open, modify, and turn to their own purposes. Understanding this baseline of horror is essential to appreciating just how bizarre and terrible the Ork intervention becomes. The Ork menace, born for war, living for battle. To understand how Orks approach the concept of capturing and repurposing a Berserker Dreadnought, we need to understand the fundamental nature of Orkish existence. The Orks aren't just another warlike species in a galaxy full of violence. They are, in a very real sense, violence incarnate, a race that was literally engineered for war and has never known any other purpose or desire. The origins of the Orks lie in the distant past, in the apocalyptic conflict known as the War in Heaven. The Old Ones, an ancient and impossibly advanced race of psychically powerful beings, faced extinction at the hands of the Necrontyre and their terrifying star gods, the Citan. In desperation, the Old Ones turned to genetic engineering and psychic manipulation to create warrior races that could stand against the Necrons' inexorable advance. Among these creations were the Krork, the precursors to modern Orks. The Krork were masterpieces of bioengineering, warrior organisms designed to be self-sustaining, infinitely reproducible, and completely dedicated to warfare. They were taller than even modern Orks, standing as much as 12 meters in height, and they possessed technology that would put even the most advanced Imperial equipment to shame. But most importantly, they were designed to thrive in conflict, to grow stronger through battle, and to reproduce through the scattering of fungal spores that would ensure a defeated Krork force could regenerate given enough time. Millions of years and countless conflicts have degraded the Krork into the Orks we know today. They've lost much of their original sophistication and technological prowess. What they haven't lost, however, is the fundamental programming that makes them the perfect warriors. Every Ork that emerges from the ground already possesses instinctive knowledge of combat, basic mechanical understanding, and an overwhelming urge to seek out conflict. This biological imperative manifests in every aspect of Orkish existence. Ork society is organized around a simple principle: might makes right. The biggest Ork is in charge, not because of any formal system of government or hereditary succession, but because he's strong enough to beat anyone who challenges him. This creates a constant cycle of violence even within Ork society, as ambitious Orks fight their way up the hierarchy, while those at the top must constantly defend their position against challengers. But the truly unique aspect of Ork biology isn't their size or strength, or even their remarkable resilience. It's the psychic field they generate, a gestalt phenomenon known as the WH40K. Every Ork produces a low-level psychic energy field, and when Orks gather in large numbers, these individual fields combine and amplify each other, creating effects that defy conventional understanding of reality. The WH40K field serves several functions. At its most basic, it allows Orks to instinctively recognize who is bigger and therefore in charge, creating a natural hierarchy without the need for formal ranks or insignia. It also grows stronger when Orks are excited, particularly during battle, creating a feedback loop where successful fighting makes the Orks stronger, which leads to more successful fighting, which makes them even stronger still. But perhaps most importantly, the way a egg field affects technology. This is where things get really interesting, and where much confusion has arisen in both in-universe Imperial understanding and out-of-universe fan discussions. The way a egg field doesn't, as some exaggerated claims suggest, allow orcs to make literally anything work through pure belief. An orc can't pick up a piece of random scrap, believe it's a gun, and have it start shooting bullets. The technology still needs to be fundamentally sound in its construction. What the WAG field does do is fill in the gaps in orc engineering. Orc technology is crude, poorly manufactured by any reasonable standard, and often assembled from mismatched components that shouldn't work together. By all rights, most orc weapons should jam constantly. Their vehicles should break down within minutes, and their ships should tear themselves apart the moment they attempt to enter the warp. The WAG field prevents these failures by subtly altering probability, by giving that extra push that makes a badly fitted bolt hole just a little longer, by ensuring that the barely functional firing mechanism pulls the trigger at just the right moment. This isn't unlimited reality warping. It's more like a cosmic helping hand that allows orc technology to function despite its obvious shortcomings. An Imperial guardsman who picks up an orc shooter might find it jams more often than it fires, but in orc hands, that same weapon will roar reliably, feeding through ammunition of slightly different calibers without issue. The weapon works for both. It just works better when the WAG field is there to smooth over the imperfections. The implications of this psychic field extend beyond just making their ramshackle technology functional. It also influences how orcs perceive and modify technology they capture from other races. When an orc mech boy examines a piece of enemy equipment, they see it through a lens colored by both their instinctive understanding of machines and their unconscious psychic connection to the WAG. They don't understand how a plasma gun works in the way an Imperial tech priest would, with detailed knowledge of magnetic containment fields and fusion reactions. Instead, they intuitively grasp that this bit connects to that bit, and if you add more of these gubbins and paint it the right color, it'll work even better. This brings us to the mech boys, the orc caste that will play the central role in our scenario. Mech boys are orcs born with an enhanced version of the instinctive technical knowledge that all orcs possess. From the moment they emerge from the ground, their heads are filled with visions of weapons and war machines, mechanical designs they don't consciously understand but can build through pure instinct. A mech boy doesn't plan out a design or consult technical specifications. They simply start hammering metal together until something that looks right emerges from the chaos. The greatest mech boys become big mechs, individuals whose technical prowess and physical size allow them to command entire warbands. These are the orcs who oversee the construction of the truly massive war machines. Gorkanauts, Morkanauts, Stompers, and even the titanic gargants that can rival Imperial titans in size. But even the average mech boy possesses skills that would baffle the most learned tech priest of Mars. Mech boys are also the orcs most directly involved in looting. When an orc warband overruns an enemy position, it's the mech boys and their assistants, the looters, who swarm over the battlefield picking through the wreckage. They'll grab anything that looks useful or interesting: weapons, armor plates, power sources, vehicle components, and sometimes entire intact vehicles. All of this material then makes its way back to the mech's workshop, where it will be examined, modified, painted, and integrated into the orc arsenal. The orc approach to looting is remarkably egalitarian in its thoroughness. They'll loot from anyone: Imperium, Tau, Eldar, Necrons, even other orcs if the opportunity presents itself. There's an entire orc clan, the Death Skulls, whose cultural identity revolves around looting. Death Skulls believe that blue is a lucky color and that anything worth having is worth taking from someone else. They're the most prolific looters in orc society, to the point that other clans view them with a mixture of envy and exasperation. What makes Ork looting particularly effective is that they don't need to understand the technology they're stealing. An Imperial Guard tank requires a crew trained in its operation, maintenance schedules, proper ammunition, and fuel. An Ork captures that same tank, and within hours, a mech boy will have it running with whatever fuel they have on hand, firing whatever ammunition seems to fit, and some that doesn't, and sporting a fresh coat of red paint because red ones go faster. The WH40K field fills in the gaps that should make this impossible, allowing the tank to function despite being run by operators who couldn't explain how an internal combustion engine works if their lives depended on it. This background is essential to understanding what happens when Orks encounter a Berserker Dreadnought. They see it not as a tomb of rage and corruption, not as a cursed fusion of machine and damned soul, but as a really big, really killy piece of equipment that just needs proper Ork handling to reach its full potential. The fact that it's tainted by chaos, that it houses a consciousness driven mad by centuries of torment, that it represents everything blasphemous and terrible about the galaxy's descent into darkness. None of this matters to the Orks. What matters is that it's stompy, it's shooty, and it's about to get a whole lot more Orky. The mechanics of Ork looting, how greenskins appropriate everything. The process of Ork looting isn't random chaos, despite how it might appear to observers. There's actually a fairly consistent methodology to how Orks acquire, modify, and deploy captured equipment, driven by a combination of instinct, practical experience, and the ever-present influence of the WH field. Understanding this process is crucial to predicting what happens when the object being looted is as complex and dangerous as a Berserker Dreadnought. The first stage of looting begins on the battlefield itself. As an Ork warband surges across enemy positions, leaving destruction in its wake, certain Orks are already thinking ahead to the spoils of victory. Looters, Orks who have managed to acquire particularly impressive weapons from fallen foes, are always on the lookout for new and better equipment. These are the Orks who'll risk enemy fire to pull a working plasma gun off a dead space marine or drag a heavy bolter back to their lines while shells explode around them. But for larger prizes, vehicles and war machines that can't simply be carried away by individual Orks, the process requires more organization. This is where the mech boys take charge. As the fighting dies down and the battlefield falls silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the crackling of fires, the mechs emerge to survey what's available. They'll walk among the wreckage with an appraising eye, kicking at damaged vehicles to see if they're worth salvaging, peering into smoking craters to check if any useful gubbins survived the explosion, and occasionally arguing with each other about who saw what piece of loot first. The criteria for what makes something worth looting are surprisingly practical. Size matters. Bigger equipment is generally better in Ork eyes because it can hold more weapons and make a louder noise. Functionality is important too, though Orks have a much more generous definition of functional than most races would accept. If it's mostly intact and looks like it could be made to work with enough bashing and welding, it's worth taking. Visual appeal also factors in. Equipment that already looks impressive or intimidating requires less modification to make it properly Orky. And of course, there's the consideration of how much it will annoy the previous owners when they see what's been done to their precious war machine. Once a mech boy decides that a piece of equipment is worth claiming, the real work begins. For something as large as a dreadnought, this means organizing a salvage crew of lesser mechs, spanners, mech apprentices, and a whole mob of Gretchen to do the actual heavy lifting. The equipment is dragged, pushed, or sometimes towed back to the Ork base, usually leaving a trail of dropped parts and oil leaks in its wake. This journey can be almost as dangerous as the battle itself, particularly if the captured equipment contains anything unstable or prone to unexpected activation. Back at the mech's workshop, the real analysis begins. This is where the Ork approach to technology becomes truly apparent. A mech boy examining a piece of captured equipment doesn't consult manuals or run diagnostic tests. Instead, they rely on a combination of instinct and experimentation. They'll bang on it with a wrench to see what sounds it makes. They'll try pulling levers and pushing buttons to see what happens. They'll disassemble parts seemingly at random, looking for components they recognize or that spark their interest. To an outside observer, this looks like complete chaos. To the mech boy, it's a methodical process of understanding, guided by genetic memory and psychic intuition. The modifications that follow are where Ork culture really expresses itself. Every mech boy has their own style, their own preferences for how things should look and work. But there are certain universal elements to Ork modification that appear regardless of individual taste. First and foremost is the addition of more weapons. Orks operate on the principle that if something can mount a gun, it should mount a gun, and if it already has a gun, it should have two guns. Empty space is wasted space. Every surface that could hold a weapon mount gets one installed, whether it makes tactical sense or not. Paint is another crucial element. Different colors have different effects in Ork belief, effects that are made real by the WH field. Red makes things go faster, so red paint is liberally applied to vehicles meant for speed. Yellow makes explosions bigger, useful for bomb carriers and artillery. Blue is lucky, favored by the death skulls. Purple is sneaky, because no one's ever seen a purple orc, a circular logic that somehow works. Black is tough and intimidating. And green, well, green is just proper orky. The act of painting captured equipment serves multiple purposes. It marks the equipment as belonging to the orcs now. It provides the psychic benefits associated with different colors, and it covers up any distressing reminders of who the equipment used to belong to. The physical modifications go beyond just weapons and paint. Spikes are added liberally, both for intimidation and for the practical purpose of having something to stick enemy heads on. Armor plates are reinforced, often by welding on more armor plates at random angles until the whole thing looks like a scrap metal sculpture. Exhaust pipes are extended and modified to belch impressive clouds of black smoke. Horns and bells are installed to make noise. Trophies from fallen enemies, skulls, banners, pieces of armor are bolted on as decorations. The goal is to create something that looks properly orky, which means big, loud, intimidating, and covered in enough spikes and guns to make any sensible enemy run away screaming. The technical modifications are harder to observe but equally important. Mech boys will rewire systems they don't fully understand, reroute power in ways that should cause catastrophic overloads, and install components from completely different technologies in ways that violate every principle of engineering. An orc-looted vehicle might run on a combination of promethium fuel, electrical batteries scavenged from a downed Tau vehicle, and what appears to be pure spite. The engine might be held together with baling wire and hope. The control systems might respond to inputs completely differently than they did originally. None of this matters as long as the WAG field is there to smooth over the impossibilities. One aspect of orc looting that often goes unremarked is how they handle the crew quarters or pilot interfaces of captured vehicles. Orcs are, on average, considerably larger than humans and most other species. They're also not particularly concerned with comfort or safety. When they capture a vehicle designed for human-sized crew, they'll simply tear out anything that's in the way to make room for their own bulk. Seats are removed. Control panels are repositioned. If a hatch is too small for an orc to fit through, they'll cut a bigger hole. The result is that even if a captured vehicle could theoretically be recaptured by its original owners, they'd find it almost impossible to operate in its modified state. The WAG field's influence on looted technology is worth examining in more detail. The field doesn't make technology work through pure belief. It enhances and stabilizes technology that's fundamentally capable of working but poorly maintained or incorrectly configured. This means that some technologies are easier for orcs to loot than others. Simple mechanical systems, projectile weapons, combustion engines. These work well under orc management because the basic principles are straightforward, and the WH field can compensate for imprecise tolerances and missing components. More complex technologies, particularly those requiring precise calibration or specific operating conditions, are harder for orcs to successfully loot. This is why orc-looted plasma weapons tend to explode more often than they should, and why orc attempts to use Necron or Tau technology sometimes end in spectacular failures. The WAG field can do a lot, but it can't overcome fundamental incompatibilities between orc understanding and the technology in question. However, the field does seem to get stronger with numbers and with belief. A single orc trying to use a piece of captured technology will have a harder time than a mob of orcs all convinced that the technology will work. This collective belief strengthens the WH field, making increasingly improbable technological feats possible. This is why some of the most impressive examples of orc looting occur during large-scale UAGs, when millions of orcs are gathered together and the psychic field reaches its peak potency. There are also documented cases of the WAG field having strange interactions with other psychic or warp-based phenomena. When orcs capture equipment that's been blessed by the Imperium or tainted by chaos, the WAG field doesn't simply override these influences. Instead, there seems to be a kind of psychic competition, a clash between different forms of warp energy that can produce unpredictable results. Sometimes the WAG field wins out, stripping away the previous taint and making the equipment purely orky. Sometimes the two influences coexist in an uneasy balance, and sometimes, in rare cases, the interaction produces something entirely new and extremely dangerous. This background on orc looting mechanics sets the stage for understanding what happens when they get their hands on a Berserker Dreadnought. They have the instinct to understand mechanical systems, even ones as complex as a Dreadnought's servo motors and weapon systems. They have the tools and knowledge to modify those systems, adding more guns and making it more orky. They have the WAG field to help bridge the gap between orc engineering and the sophisticated technology of a space marine war machine. What they don't have, and what makes this scenario so unpredictable, is any understanding of or concern for the chaos-tainted consciousness trapped inside the machine, or how their modifications might affect the delicate balance between the pilot's rage, the warp's influence, and the Dreadnought's systems. The capture, when green tide meets red fury. The scenario of orcs actually capturing a Berserker Dreadnought isn't as far-fetched as it might initially seem. While these Chaos War machines are formidable opponents capable of devastating entire companies of enemy troops, they're not invulnerable, and orcs possess both the numbers and the cunning to bring one down intact. Let's consider the most likely scenarios for how such a capture might occur. The first and most straightforward would be during a large-scale battle where orc numbers simply overwhelm Chaos forces. Berserker Dreadnoughts, for all their fury and firepower, have a critical weakness. Their pilots are often beyond the point of rational tactical thinking. A Berserker Dreadnought pilot doesn't carefully consider fields of fire and defensive positions. They charge directly at the nearest enemy, consequences be damned, driven by an insatiable need to close to melee range and tear their foes apart. This suicidal aggression plays right into orc hands. Orcs love a good scrap, and they have no fear of taking casualties in pursuit of victory. When a Berserker Dreadnought charges into an orc mob, it might kill dozens of boys in the first few seconds, its power fist crushing bodies, and its weapons reducing orcs to smoking craters. But orcs don't break and run when faced with casualties. If anything, the sight of a proper fight gets them more excited, drawing more and more orcs to the battle. What starts as one mob facing the Dreadnought quickly becomes 2 mobs, then 5, then 10. The Berserker Dreadnought pilot, lost in their rage, doesn't recognize the danger until it's too late. They're surrounded by a green tide of angry orcs, all trying to get their chopper into the fight. The Dreadnought's weapons are formidable, but they have limited ammunition and relatively slow traverse speeds. By the time it's finished cutting down one mob of orcs, 3 more have closed to melee range, beating on its armor with whatever weapons they can bring to bear. This is where the capture becomes possible. Orcs are surprisingly good at taking things apart, particularly when those things are currently trying to kill them. They'll target the Dreadnought's weapon arms, mobbing them with power claws and rockets until the weapons are disabled or torn free. They'll swarm over the chassis, jamming choppers into joints and trying to find weak points in the armor. They'll throw everything they have at it: grenades, tank shells, heavy weapons fire, and their own bodies if necessary. Eventually, the weight of numbers tells. The Berserker Dreadnought's power supply becomes overtaxed. Its weapons run dry of ammunition. Its servo motors, never designed to fight off hundreds of attackers simultaneously, start to fail under the strain. It topples, brought low by the sheer mass of orcs crawling over it. Even then, the pilot might still be dangerous, the Dreadnought's systems fighting to stand, to kill, to fulfill the blood-soaked purpose for which it was created. But orcs are nothing if not persistent, and eventually they'll manage to immobilize the machine completely. Another possible capture scenario involves orc cunning rather than just brute force. The Blood Axes, a clan of orcs known for their willingness to use actual tactics instead of just charging straight ahead, are particularly adept at this kind of operation. They might use their own vehicles as bait, deliberately allowing a Berserker Dreadnought to get close before springing a trap. Imagine a carefully arranged battlefield where the Dreadnought charges through what appears to be fleeing orc vehicles, only to find itself stuck in a pit that's been disguised with scrap metal and carefully positioned wreckage. Or consider a scenario where an orc mech boy has cobbled together something resembling a net launcher from captured Imperial or Tau technology, firing massive steel cables at the Dreadnought to tangle its legs and bring it crashing down. The orcs then swarm over it before it can cut itself free, disabling its weapons and perhaps even managing to pry open access hatches to throw in stick bombs or grot mobs to disable it from within. There's also the possibility of a Berserker Dreadnought being captured after its Chaos Space Marine warband has already been defeated. Perhaps the Dreadnought's kill count was so high that it exhausted its ammunition and fuel, leaving it immobile on the battlefield. Perhaps it took damage from Imperial or other forces that disabled it without destroying it outright. When the orcs arrive to loot the battlefield, they find a dormant but intact Berserker Dreadnought, just waiting to be claimed. The moment of capture itself is probably quite a sight. Imagine the scene: a battlefield littered with the dead from multiple factions, the ground churned to mud by tank treads and torn by artillery craters. In the middle of it all, a Berserker Dreadnought stands motionless, or perhaps fallen on its side, smoke rising from damaged systems. The orcs approach cautiously at first, not out of fear, but out of the kind of wariness you'd show a particularly large and potentially unstable bomb. The first orc to reach it might give it an experimental kick, seeing if it responds. When nothing happens immediately, more orcs gather around, their excitement building. They've got themselves a proper prize here, something that will make the mech boys very happy indeed. Orders are shouted in the guttural orc language. Gretchen are sent scurrying to fetch tow cables and makeshift cranes, and the serious work of moving this massive piece of war machinery begins. But here's where things get interesting, because a Berserker Dreadnought isn't like a regular vehicle. Inside that armored sarcophagus, assuming the pilot isn't dead, is a consciousness that's very much aware of what's happening. The pilot can see through the Dreadnought's optical sensors, can hear the guttural orc speech, can feel through the machine's sensors as crude orc hands bang and prod at its armor. And that pilot, mad with rage and tormented by centuries of imprisonment, is not going to take this quietly. Even disabled, even immobilized, the pilot can potentially activate systems. Vox speakers might crackle to life, broadcasting screams of rage and promises of blood and death. If any weapon systems still have power, they might try to fire, causing orcs to scatter as a damaged assault cannon spits out its last few rounds or a power fist clenches spasmodically. The Dreadnought might try to stand, servo motors groaning and sparking as they fight against damaged components and orc grappling cables. The orcs' reaction to this display would likely be a mixture of excitement and practical problem-solving. Some might cheer, thrilled that their prize still has fight in it. Others might whack the Dreadnought with wrenches and pipes, trying to knock some sense into it like you might slap a malfunctioning machine. The more technically minded mech boys might start examining it even while it's still active, looking for ways to shut it down without causing too much additional damage. Eventually, through a combination of brute force, technical interference, and possibly just the Dreadnought running out of power, the machine is subdued and secured. Heavy chains are wrapped around it, not because the Orks necessarily know that Chaos Space Marines sometimes chain their Hellbrutes between battles, but because chains look proper intimidating, and that's just how you secure big dangerous things. The Dreadnought is loaded onto whatever transport the Orks have available, which might be a looted Imperial truck, a ramshackle Ork battle wagon, or simply dragged behind a squadron of war tracks. As the war machine is hauled back to the Ork base, other Orks gather to look at it. Word spreads quickly in Ork society, particularly when there's something worth boasting about. "We got ourselves a proper stompy," they'll say. "Took down one of them spiky beaky's walkie killers." There's pride here, the satisfaction of having captured a particularly impressive piece of enemy equipment. There's also anticipation, because everyone knows what comes next. The mech boys are going to make it into something properly Orky. The Berserker Dreadnought is transported to a mech boy workshop, which is less a formal facility and more a chaotic assembly area where half-finished projects compete for space with piles of scrap metal and the occasional unexplained explosion. Here, surrounded by the tools and materials of Ork engineering, the real transformation will begin. But before the mechs can start their work, they need to understand what they're dealing with. And that means the pilot inside the Dreadnought is about to have visitors, whether they want them or not. The Orks have their prize. They have the tools to modify it. They have the wet ag field to help make their modifications work despite all logical impossibilities. What they don't have is any concept of the horror they're about to unleash, or the strange and terrible fusion that will result when Ork enthusiasm meets chaos, madness, in the form of a walking war machine that houses a consciousness that should have been allowed to die centuries ago. Mech boys at work. The transformation begins. The mech boy workshop, where the Berserker Dreadnought is taken, isn't a quiet, sterile laboratory. It's a cacophony of noise, a riot of sparks and smoke, and a place where the normal rules of engineering safety are considered more like gentle suggestions that can be ignored if they get in the way of a good bit of work. The Dreadnought is unceremoniously dumped in a relatively clear area, chains still wrapped around it, and the mech boys gather to examine their new project. The head mech boy, let's call him Bolt Crusher, because all Orks have names that are either descriptive of what they do or aspirational about what they want to do, approaches the Dreadnought with the confidence of someone who has taken apart and rebuilt 100 war machines. He's flanked by his assistants, smaller mechs, spanners learning the trade, and a small horde of Gretchen who scurry about fetching tools and trying not to get stepped on. Bolt Crusher walks a slow circle around the Dreadnought, occasionally banging on its armor with a wrench to see what kind of sound it makes, peering at damaged sections to see what's visible underneath. "Right then," Bolt Crusher might grunt, his voice carrying the authority of an Ork who knows his way around mechanical things. "Let's see what we got here." He gestures to a couple of spanners. "You lot, start getting them weapon arms off, carefully like. We might be able to use them for something. And you," he points at a Gretchen, "get me the big wrench, the really big one. We're going to need to get inside this thing." This is where things get interesting, because inside that armored sarcophagus, the Berserker Dreadnought's pilot is very much aware of what's happening. Through the Dreadnought's sensor feeds, blurry and damaged as they might be, the pilot can see the Orks gathering around. Through audio receptors, they can hear the guttural Ork speech, the clang of tools, the excited chattering of the Gretchen. And through whatever connection remains between their consciousness and the Dreadnought systems, they can feel the vibrations as Ork tools begin working on the chassis. For a being that has spent centuries or even millennia trapped in rage and madness, this is a new form of torment. The pilot isn't being fought, isn't killing, isn't even being properly destroyed. They're being examined. prodded, treated like a piece of equipment rather than a warrior. For a follower of Khorne, for someone whose entire existence has been reduced to the pursuit of blood and skulls, this indignity might be worse than any battlefield defeat. The pilot tries to respond. If any power remains in the Dreadnought's systems, they'll use it. Vox speakers crackle, and a voice emerges, distorted by damaged systems and the warp's influence, speaking in a language the Orks don't understand, but recognize as someone being properly angry. "Blood for the blood god," the pilot might scream, or "skulls for the skull throne," or simply an incoherent howl of rage that makes the air itself seem to vibrate with malevolence. The Orcs' reaction to this display is probably not what the pilot expects. Instead of fear or caution, there's actually a kind of appreciation. "Oi!" one of the mechs might call out. "This one's still got some fight in it. That's good, that is. Means it ain't completely busted." The fact that the machine houses a tormented consciousness driven mad by chaos corruption doesn't concern them. If anything, they're pleased that their captured equipment still has some life to it. As the mech boys begin their work in earnest, they start to discover just how complex their prize actually is. Unlike looted Imperial vehicles, which are straightforward to understand even if they're difficult to keep running, the Berserker Dreadnought is a fusion of multiple technological paradigms. There's the baseline space marine technology, sophisticated beyond anything the Imperium regularly produces. There's the modifications made during and after the Horus Heresy, adaptations for close combat and aggressive tactics. And there's the chaos corruption, warp-tainted systems that don't follow normal rules of cause and effect. The mech boys don't recognize all of this consciously, but they sense it. When they start disassembling parts of the Dreadnought, they find components that seem to shift and change when they're not looking directly at them. Wiring that appears to be made of a combination of conventional cables and something that might be organic tissue. Power systems that draw on sources that don't correspond to any fuel they recognize. It's all very interesting, in the way that a potentially explosive puzzle is interesting. "Dis bit here," Bolt Crusher might say, pointing at a particularly warped section of the Dreadnought's chassis. "This ain't normal metal. Look how it's all wiggly." He prods it with a finger, and the metal seems to recoil slightly, as if it's somehow alive. "Reckon it's that chaos stuff the beakies are always going on about." He shrugs. "Ah, well, more spikes means it's more killier, I suppose." The modification process begins with the weapons. This is Ork priority number 1, making sure there's enough dakka. The Berserker Dreadnought likely came equipped with close combat weapons optimized for ripping through enemy formations, and possibly some ranged. Weapons for engaging targets before closing to melee. In Ork eyes, this is woefully insufficient. There's all this empty space on the chassis where more guns could go, working with the enthusiasm that only Orks can muster for the task of adding more violence to an already violent machine. The mech boys begin attaching additional weapons. A big shooter here, welded onto what used to be an aesthetic armor plate. A rocket launcher there, bolted to the shoulder assembly. Maybe they find some Ork heavy weapons lying around the workshop and just start attaching them wherever they'll fit. A custom mega blaster gets mounted to one arm. A flamer gets added because fire is always good for making enemies scream, and screaming enemies are easier to find. The close combat weapons get special attention. The Dreadnought's existing power fist is impressive, but it could be better. The mechs add more spikes to it, great jagged lengths of metal that serve no practical purpose but look proper orky. They might weld on some chain blades at the knuckles, or add a claw from a death dread to give it more grabby bits. The goal is to make it so that anything the fist hits not only gets crushed, but also gets shredded, impaled, and generally rendered into component parts as messily as possible. While the mechanical modifications are happening, other Orks are addressing the appearance of the Dreadnought. It arrives in whatever colors the Chaos Warband painted it, likely a lot of red for the World Eaters, brass trim representing Khorne's favor, and probably an unsettling amount of bloodstains. This simply will not do. The Dreadnought needs to look orky, which means it needs proper paint. This is where clan allegiance comes into play. If the capturing orcs are blood axes, they might paint it green and add camouflage patterns, because they actually understand the concept of stealth, even if they don't use it that often. If they're evil sons, it's getting painted red, because red makes it go faster, and a fast Dreadnought is better than a slow one. If they're death skulls, they'll paint it blue for luck, possibly adding white details to represent bones or skulls as clan symbols. Bad moons might add yellow and black in intricate patterns, showing off their wealth. Goths would stick with black and add plenty of white or red skull imagery. Regardless of the specific colors chosen, the paint job is thorough. Orcs don't do subtle shading or careful blending. They slap paint on with whatever passes for brushes in their society, which might be actual brushes, or might be bundles of squig hair, or might just be their hands. The goal is coverage, not artistry, though some orcs do take pride in making their paint jobs look properly intimidating. The Dreadnought gets multiple coats, often in different colors in different areas, until whatever its original appearance was has been completely obscured. But paint alone isn't enough to make something properly orky. The mech boys begin adding decorative elements. Trophies from fallen enemies are a favorite. Skulls, which there are usually plenty of lying around after any orc victory, get mounted on spikes welded to the chassis. Armor plates from defeated space marines might be bolted on as additional protection, or just for the bragging rights. Banners and flags are attached to poles welded to the Dreadnought's back or shoulders, usually crudely drawn with clan symbols, or just the orc glyph for kill or smash, repeated over and over. More spikes are added, because you can never have too many spikes. They're welded on at random angles, creating a forest of sharp metal protrusions that make the Dreadnought look like a particularly aggressive sea urchin had a baby with a junkyard. Some of these spikes serve the practical purpose of discouraging enemies from getting too close. Others are just there because they look good, and spiky things are inherently more intimidating than smooth things. The really creative mechs might add mechanical details that serve no purpose except to look impressive. Extra exhaust pipes that don't connect to anything might be welded onto the shoulders, positioned to belch smoke dramatically. Chains might be strung between various points on the chassis, hung with more skulls or shell casings, or just dangling there because chains look proper tough. Speakers might be added to amplify sounds, either the pilot's screams, if they're still making any, or just general orky battle cries recorded by a particularly enthusiastic grot with a microphone. Through all of this, the modifications to the Dreadnought's internal systems continue. The mech boys work with the kind of casual confidence that comes from having repaired 1,000 machines without really understanding how any of them work. They rewire power systems, often creating shortcuts that should cause massive electrical fires but somehow don't. They reconfigure the servo motors that control the Dreadnought's movements, usually making them louder and more violent in their operation, but also potentially faster and stronger, thanks to the WH field compensating for the loss of fine control. The sarcophagus itself, the armored chamber that houses the pilot, presents a special challenge. The mech boys need to be able to access the Dreadnought's control systems, but they also don't want to completely expose whatever is inside. Their solution is typically brutally pragmatic. They cut additional access hatches into the armor, crude openings covered by bolted-on plates that can be removed when maintenance is needed. These cuts often sever or damage the delicate connections between the sarcophagus and the Dreadnought systems, connections that were already barely holding together after the battle that led to the capture. For the pilot inside, this entire process is a unique form of torture. They can feel every modification, every cut into their mechanical body. The rewiring of systems sends feedback through the neural connections, causing pain that their damaged nervous system interprets as both physical and spiritual violation. The addition of new weapons feels like having foreign limbs grafted on, limbs that respond to control inputs but don't feel right, don't move with the precision and purpose that weapons of horn should possess. Worst of all, perhaps, is the gradual awareness that they're becoming something different. The chaos corruption that has sustained the pilot all these centuries, the connection to Khorne that has given their rage purpose and direction, is being diluted by something else. The WAG field is seeping into the Dreadnought systems, carried by the mech boys as they work and amplified by the presence of the many Orks in the workshop. It's a psychic intrusion, a green tide of enthusiastic violence washing over the Red Sea of Khornate fury. The two forms of warp influence, chaos corruption and WAG energy, don't mix cleanly. They're fundamentally different expressions of psychic power, one ordered and directed by the will of a chaos god, the other a chaotic gestalt field generated by a species that exists purely for war. As they meet in the systems of the Berserker Dreadnought, strange things begin to happen. Systems that were damaged begin to function again, not repaired in any conventional sense, but working anyway because the field believes they should work. But they don't function the way they originally did. The chaos corruption twists the effect, creating hybrid systems that respond to both Ork input and to the pilot's rage in unpredictable ways. The Dreadnought's weapons, now a mix of original armaments and Ork additions, start to take on characteristics of both technologies. An assault cannon that's been modified by Orks might fire with a rhythm that sounds almost like a roar of fury, each shell carrying a fragment of the pilot's rage along with its explosive charge. The physical transformation of the Dreadnought is dramatic, but the psychic transformation is even more profound. The pilot, trapped in their sarcophagus, begins to feel their consciousness fragmenting in new ways. Part of them is still connected to Khorne, still screaming for blood and skulls. But another part, one they don't recognize and can't control, is beginning to resonate with the WAG field. It's a violation of everything they believe in, everything they've become, and yet they can't stop it any more than they could stop the Orks from modifying their prison. The mech boys, blissfully unaware of the metaphysical crisis they're causing, continue their work with enthusiasm. They stand back periodically to admire their progress, discussing whether the Dreadnought needs more guns. It always needs more guns. Whether the paint job is proper intimidating, it probably needs another coat. And whether they should add any final touches before declaring the project complete. What about some flames? One mech suggests, gesturing at the Dreadnought's chassis. Painted flames like running up the legs, makes it look like it's on fire even when it ain't. Nah, Bolt Crusher might reply. We ain't got time for fancy stuff. Besides, when this thing gets into a proper scrap, it'll probably be on fire for real anyway. That's the best kind of flames, the ones that actually burn stuff. As the modifications near completion, the mech boys face one final decision. What to do about the pilot. They're aware there's something alive in the sarcophagus. The screaming and the occasional violent activation of systems make that clear. But they don't really understand what it is or how it relates to the Dreadnought's operation. Some mechs argue for trying to remove it and installing an Ork pilot instead. Others point out that whatever is in there seems to know how to make the Dreadnought fight. And that's valuable knowledge, even if the pilot is a bit moody about the whole situation. The compromise they reach is typically Orky in its brutal simplicity. They'll leave the pilot in place, but modify the control systems so that Orks can override it if necessary. They install crude control mechanisms, big levers and buttons that an Ork can use to make the Dreadnought walk forward, turn, and fire weapons completely separate from the neural interface the pilot uses. They add a hatch on top of the Dreadnought where an Ork can ride and operate these controls, essentially turning the war machine into a vehicle with a very angry and very dangerous engine. The final touch is a name. Every proper Ork war machine needs a name, something that describes what it does or what happened to get it. The mech boys debate this among themselves, throwing out suggestions. "Does Stompy Git?" one offers. "Spikey's Revenge," suggests another, acknowledging the Dreadnought's chaos origins. "Daka Fist!" someone yells, pointing out the many guns now mounted on the fists. Eventually, they settle on something that captures the essence of what they've created. Gork's fist, or Mork's stomper, or perhaps, in a moment of inspired Orky poetry, Dread Rage, acknowledging both the Dreadnought's newly painted red color scheme and the furious consciousness still trapped inside it. The modifications complete, the chains are removed, and the Dreadnought is commanded to stand. This is the moment of truth, when they'll discover whether all their work has produced a functional war machine or just a very elaborate piece of scrap metal. The pilot, if they're still capable of coherent thought through the haze of rage and psychic corruption and WH40K field contamination, might try to resist. But the combination of modified control systems and the WH40K field's influence on the Dreadnought's machinery means that resistance is futile. The Dreadnought stands. Its servos whine with a sound they never made before, somewhere between the smooth mechanical purr of space marine technology and the grinding roar of Ork machinery. Its weapons track back and forth, testing ranges of motion. Smoke belches from the new exhaust pipes. Painted metal gleams in whatever light the workshop provides. And inside, the pilot screams, a sound that's equal parts rage, horror, and something that might, in a creature not completely consumed by chaos, be recognized as despair. The mech boys cheer. They've done it. They've taken a piece of enemy equipment and made it properly Orky. It's covered in guns, painted the right colors, and ready for a scrap. That it also contains a consciousness that's experiencing a form of torment that transcends anything mere mortals were meant to endure doesn't concern them. As far as they're concerned, if it's got fight in it, that just makes it better. Right, Bolt Crusher might declare, admiring their work. Let's get this thing to the boss. Time to show him what we made. The transformed Berserker Dreadnought, now a hybrid monstrosity that combines chaos corruption, Ork engineering, and psychic energy in ways that should be impossible, takes its first steps as an Ork war machine. The universe just became a slightly stranger and more dangerous place, and somewhere in the warp, the Chaos Gods might be watching with something between amusement and concern, while Gork and Mork, the Ork deities, are probably just laughing their massive green heads off. The fusion of rage. What happens to the pilot? While the mech boys celebrate their successful conversion of the Berserker Dreadnought into a proper Orky war machine, the true horror of what they've created becomes apparent when we consider what's happening to the consciousness trapped inside the sarcophagus. The pilot, already driven to the edge of sanity by centuries of torment, is now experiencing something entirely new. The forced fusion of cornate corruption with Wajar energy, mediated through the crude modifications of Ork engineering. The pilot's experience begins with violation. For however long they've been interred in the Dreadnought, their existence has been defined by connection to Khorne, the blood god. That connection is what sustained them through the madness, what's given their rage purpose and direction. Every kill they made, every enemy they destroyed, was an offering to Khorne, feeding the god's endless appetite for blood and skulls. This service, however horrific it appeared to outsiders, was their identity, their reason for continuing to exist in their metal prison. Now, that connection is being interfered with by something alien and incomprehensible. The WH40K field isn't chaos corruption. It's something fundamentally different, a psychic phenomenon generated by a species that exists outside the normal hierarchies of the warp. When WH40K energy begins permeating the Dreadnought systems, carried by the mech boys as they work, and amplified by their modifications, it creates a psychic noise that disrupts the pilot's connection to Khorne. Imagine trying to maintain a conversation with someone you can barely hear, except the conversation is what keeps you sane, and the interference is being caused by what sounds like several thousand people having the best party of their lives, while simultaneously beating each other with hammers. That's approximately what the pilot experiences as the WH40K field grows stronger in their vicinity. The familiar whispers of Horn, the demands for blood and skulls that have been the soundtrack of their existence, become garbled and mixed with something else. Enthusiastic roaring, the psychic equivalent of engines revving, and an overwhelming sense of excited anticipation for the next good fight. The physical modifications to the Dreadnought exacerbate this psychic conflict. Each piece of Ork technology that's added comes with its own small fragment of WH40K energy, a psychic fingerprint left by the mech who installed it. These fragments accumulate, building up like static charge until the entire Dreadnought is suffused with an energy field that's equal parts chaos, corruption, and orcish enthusiasm. The pilot can feel it in every sensor reading, every movement of their mechanical body. Systems that used to respond with precision and malice now respond with something closer to enthusiasm, eagerness. These aren't emotions a follower of Horn should be feeling, and yet they're there, invasive and undeniable. The color of the paint matters more than a rational person would expect. If the Orks painted the Dreadnought red, claiming it will make it go faster, the WH40K field actually starts to make that true. The Dreadnought becomes faster, its servos responding more quickly, its stride lengthening. The pilot feels this acceleration, feels their metal body becoming nimbler, and the sensation is disorienting. They're used to the Dreadnought being an unstoppable juggernaut, plowing through enemies with inexorable force. This new speed, this almost playful agility, feels wrong. If the Dreadnought was painted blue for luck, the pilot might start experiencing improbable coincidences. Enemy shots that should hit seem to miss by improbable margins. The Dreadnought stumbles during battle and somehow ends up in a better tactical position than if it had walked there deliberately. These aren't the kinds of blessings Khorne grants. The Blood God favors straightforward violence, not subtle fortune. But the WH40K field doesn't care about theological consistency. The psychological impact of this fusion is profound. The pilot's rage, which has been their constant companion for centuries, begins to take on new characteristics. It's still rage, still burning hot and demanding blood, but it's becoming less focused, less ritualistic. Khornate rage is purposeful. It seeks to honor the Blood God through acts of violence that are as much religious ceremony as combat. WH40K-influenced rage is more playful. It wants violence for the joy of violence, not as an offering to any higher power. This shift creates a kind of identity crisis for the pilot. They've defined themselves by their service to Khorne for so long that any deviation from that path feels like losing grip on the last thread of coherence they possess. But they can't stop the change any more than they could stop the mech boys from modifying their prison. The WH40K field permeates everything, changing the fundamental nature of their existence whether they consent or not. Some pilots might try to resist, to cling to their Khornate identity with desperate fervor. They'll scream prayers to the Blood God, trying to drown out the psychic interference with pure force of will. They'll focus all their remaining consciousness on maintaining that connection to the warp, to the source of their power and purpose. This resistance can actually make things worse, creating a kind of psychic feedback loop, where chaos corruption and WH40K energy clash directly within the Dreadnought systems. The manifestation of this conflict depends on the strength of both influences. If the chaos corruption is particularly strong, if the pilot has been dedicated to Khorne for millennia, and their connection to the Blood God is deep and well established, they might be able to resist the WH40K field's influence to some degree. The Dreadnought becomes a battleground for two competing psychic energies, with neither able to fully dominate. Systems might activate randomly as the two influences fight for control. Weapons might fire without input from either the pilot or the Ork controllers. The Dreadnought might move erratically, torn between the pilot's rage and the WH40K field's enthusiasm. If the WH40K field is stronger, particularly if the Dreadnought is being operated near a large gathering of Orks, or during an active WH40K campaign, when the field is at its peak potency, the Khornate influence might be suppressed almost completely. The pilot would find their connection to Khorne reduced to a dim whisper, overshadowed by the roaring enthusiasm of Ork psychic energy. This might be the most horrifying outcome for the pilot, to feel their god abandoning them, or rather, to be separated from their god by sheer psychic interference, unable to fulfill the one purpose that sustained them through centuries of torment. But there's a third possibility, perhaps the strangest and most disturbing: genuine fusion. Instead of two separate influences fighting for control, they might begin to merge, creating something entirely new. The pilot's rage remains, but it becomes less focused on honoring Khorne and more oriented toward the simple joy of violence that Orks embody. The connection to chaos doesn't disappear, but it's filtered through the WH field, transformed into something that's neither purely Khornate nor purely Orky. This fusion might manifest in unpredictable ways. The Dreadnought's weapons, when fired, might produce effects that combine both influences. An assault cannon blessed by Khorne and modified by Orks might fire shells that seek out enemy leaders with demonic intelligence while also making a satisfyingly loud daka 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 sound that delights the Ork sensibilities. A power fist might strike with the weight of Khorne's rage behind it, while also incorporating the Ork belief that the spiked additions make it hit harder, resulting in impacts that exceed what either influence could produce alone. The pilot themselves might begin to change in more fundamental ways. Chaos corruption has already transformed their flesh, fusing it with the Dreadnought's machinery in ways that defy biological understanding. Now, the WH field begins adding its own modifications. The flesh might take on a greenish tinge, a side effect of exposure to concentrated Ork psychic energy. The pilot's thoughts, what remains of them, might begin to pattern themselves more like Ork thinking, direct, violence-focused, but with less of the ritualistic precision that Khorne demands, and more of the enthusiastic chaos that Orks embrace. In the most extreme cases, the pilot might begin to lose their sense of being separate from the Dreadnought entirely. The machine has always been their body in a sense, the only body they've known since internment. But now, with the WH field helping to bridge the gaps in the neural interface and the chaos corruption tying their essence to the metal, the boundaries become even more blurred. They are the Dreadnought. The Dreadnought is them. And the Dreadnought is now, whether they like it or not, at least partially Orky. This creates a bizarre situation where the pilot might find themselves thinking in ways they don't recognize as their own. Ork speech patterns might creep into their internal monologue. Instead of thinking, blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne, they might catch themselves thinking, we's gonna crump dem gets good and proper. This linguistic contamination is horrifying for a chaos space marine, for whom identity and purpose are the last things they have left. But it's also potentially irresistible, because the WH field makes such thoughts feel right in a way that bypasses rational consideration. The physical sensations the pilot experiences through the Dreadnought's sensors also change. Before the Ork modifications, even damaged and corrupted sensors provided relatively clear data about the environment. Now, that data is filtered through Ork modifications and colored by the WH field. Colors might seem more vivid, particularly red, because red makes things go faster, and everyone knows that. Sounds might seem louder and more exciting. The impact of their weapons hitting targets might feel more satisfying, not because the damage is greater, but because the WH field interprets violence as inherently enjoyable. Some pilots might find a kind of twisted relief in this transformation. For centuries, they've existed in a state of unfulfilled rage, killing but never satisfied, serving Khorne but never feeling his approval, trapped in a metal prison with no hope of release. The WH field offers something different. The promise that violence can be enjoyed for its own sake, that fighting doesn't need to be ritualistic or purposeful, that the simple act of smashing enemies into paste is sufficient justification for existence. This is, in its own way, a kind of corruption as profound as anything chaos could inflict. It's the corruption of purpose, the stripping away of meaning from violence until all that's left is the act itself. But it might also be the closest thing to peace that a Berserker Dreadnought pilot could experience. The peace of no longer needing to care about theology or purpose, of simply existing as an instrument of destruction without the weight of divine expectation. Other pilots might cling desperately to their Hornate identity, seeing the WH40K's influence as the ultimate betrayal, worse than any defeat on the battlefield. They might fight against it with every fragment of will they possess, trying to maintain their connection to the blood god, even as it becomes harder and harder to hear Khorne's demands through the psychic interference. This resistance creates its own form of torment, a constant internal battle that adds another layer of suffering to an existence already defined by pain. The outcome of this psychological and spiritual crisis varies from pilot to pilot and depends heavily on circumstances. A pilot who was only recently interred might have more of their original personality intact and might be able to maintain some sense of self separate from both the chaos corruption and the WH field. A pilot who has been in their sarcophagus for millennia, whose personality has long since dissolved into pure rage and madness, might be more susceptible to being reshaped by the new psychic influences. What's certain is that the being operating the Dreadnought after Ork modification is fundamentally different from what it was before. It's no longer purely a servant of Khorne, no longer a champion of chaos in any conventional sense, but it's also not Orky, not really, despite the paint and the guns and the WAG field permeating its systems. It's something in between, something new and strange and deeply wrong on multiple levels. This hybrid existence might be the cruelest fate of all for the pilot. At least as a pure Khornate warrior, they had purpose. At least they knew who they were, even if that identity was one of madness and violence. Now, they're neither one thing nor another, trapped in a state of constant confusion and conflict that makes their previous torment seem almost simple by comparison. They're a walking violation of both chaos theology and Ork culture, a thing that shouldn't exist but does anyway, because the galaxy is vast and strange, and sometimes the most improbable combinations occur simply because there's nothing to prevent them. And soon, very soon, this hybrid monstrosity will be deployed to battle, where it will unleash its confused fury on whoever the Orks pointed at. The galaxy is about to discover that there are worse things than a Berserker Dreadnought dedicated to Khorne, and one of those things is a Berserker Dreadnought that doesn't know what it is anymore, but is fully committed to finding out through the application of extreme violence. Battlefield performance, the hybrid monstrosity unleashed. When the Ork-modified Berserker Dreadnought finally takes to the battlefield, the result is something that defies easy categorization. It's not quite a chaos war machine anymore, but it's definitely not an Ork Def Dread either. What it is, fundamentally, is a concentration of violence and confusion wrapped in several tons of spiked, painted metal and backed by two incompatible forms of psychic energy that somehow manage to work in terrible harmony. The first deployment is probably something to behold. Picture an Ork warband assembling for battle, the usual chaos of boys loading up in transports, mechs making last-minute adjustments to vehicles, and the general din of an army that approaches warfare as a combination of military operation and the universe's best party. Then, in the midst of this organized chaos, the modified Dreadnought emerges from the mech's workshop. The Orks' reaction is a mixture of pride and anticipation. Here is their creation, their trophy from previous battles now converted into something properly Orky. It's covered in guns, it's painted the right color, and the way it moves, with that combination of mechanical precision and barely controlled violence, suggests it's going to be proper brutal in a scrap. The Ork chosen to ride on top and operate the crude control systems probably feels a mixture of excitement and healthy wariness. After all, the thing inside the Dreadnought is still clearly angry about something, and being in close proximity to that much rage is exciting, but also potentially dangerous. As the warband advances toward the enemy, the Dreadnought takes its place in the formation. This is where things start to get interesting, because the pilot inside is experiencing combat through their modified prison for the first time. The familiar rush of approaching battle is there. The anticipation of violence that's been the only thing that's kept them sane, or at least functional, for centuries. But it's mixed with something new. The WH40K field building in intensity as the orcs around them get more excited for the coming fight. The enemy, whoever they happen to be in this scenario, might initially misidentify the threat. If they're Imperial forces, they might see what appears to be a Chaos Dreadnought and prepare to engage it with anti-armor weapons. If they're Chaos forces themselves, they might recognize the Dreadnought as one of their own at first, leading to fatal moments of confusion when it doesn't respond to Vox hails and seems to be charging alongside the Orks instead of fighting them. If they're Xenos forces, unfamiliar with both Chaos and Orks, they're just seeing another war machine that needs to be destroyed. When the battle is joined, when the Dreadnought finally gets to engage the enemy, the true nature of what the Orks have created becomes apparent. The weapons open fire, and the sound they make is unlike anything expected. The assault cannon doesn't produce the clean, rapid reports of well-maintained Space Marine weaponry. Instead, it roars with a sound that's somewhere between mechanical precision and Orky enthusiasm, each burst of fire seeming to express both rage and glee simultaneously. The shells it fires hit with devastating effect, but the pattern of fire is erratic, switching between carefully aimed shots that speak to the pilot's centuries of combat experience and wild sprays that suggest someone or something is just happy to be shooting at things. The close combat weapons are where the hybrid nature of the Dreadnought really shines, in the most horrific sense of that word. When the Power Fist connects with an enemy, it hits with the accumulated force of Cornate Rage, Ork modifications, and the WH40K field's belief that bigger and spikier means harder hitting. The result is impacts that exceed what should be physically possible from a war machine of that size. Enemy vehicles don't just get damaged, they get crumpled like paper. Infantry don't just die, they get reduced to components so thoroughly that identifying what they used to be becomes impossible. But the Dreadnought's movements in combat aren't the smooth, practiced motions of a veteran warrior. They're jerky, unpredictable, as if the machine is fighting against itself, even as it's fighting the enemy. Sometimes it moves with the calculated efficiency of a Space Marine war machine, positioning itself to maximize damage and minimize exposure to enemy fire. Other times, it charges forward with the reckless enthusiasm of an Ork who's just spotted a really good fight and wants to get stuck in, before anyone else claims all the good killing. The pilot's experience during this combat is probably the closest thing to sensory overload that a being trapped in a Dreadnought can experience. They're processing combat data through sensors that have been modified by Orks and are now filtering information through the lens of the WH40K field. Every kill registers with them in two ways simultaneously: the familiar satisfaction of blood spilled for Khorne, and the new, strange enjoyment of a really good smashing. It's disorienting and overwhelming, but it's also the most intensely alive they've felt in longer than they can remember. The Ork, riding on top of the Dreadnought, operating the crude control systems, is having the time of his life. From his perspective, he's driving the biggest, shootiest, stompiest thing on the battlefield, and it's performing exactly like an Ork war machine should, with maximum violence and minimum concern for its own safety. When he pulls the lever that makes the Dreadnought charge forward, it charges with an enthusiasm that almost throws him off his perch. When he presses the button that fires the weapons, the Dreadnought opens up with everything it has, creating a symphony of destruction that makes other Orks stop and watch in admiration. But there are moments when the Ork controller realizes that the Dreadnought isn't entirely under his control. Sometimes it turns to face an enemy that the Ork hadn't noticed yet, moving with the tactical awareness of the pilot inside rather than responding to external commands. Sometimes it prioritizes targets in ways that don't make sense from an Orky perspective, but that might make perfect sense to a Khornate warrior. choosing to engage the enemy champion in single combat rather than mowing down the easier targets nearby. This creates a strange kind of cooperation between the Ork controller and the Chaos pilot. Neither can fully dominate the Dreadnought's actions. The Ork provides crude, directional control and weapon authorization, pointing the Dreadnought at concentrations of enemies and telling it when to shoot. The pilot provides the actual combat skill, the centuries of experience that allow the Dreadnought to fight effectively, even against overwhelming odds. Together, somehow, they create a fighting style that's more effective than either could achieve alone, even if neither fully understands or acknowledges this partnership. Enemy forces attempting to destroy the Dreadnought find it frustratingly difficult to predict its behavior. Standard anti-Dreadnought tactics assume a certain degree of tactical rationality, an expectation that the war machine will fight to maximize its survival and effectiveness. This Dreadnought doesn't follow those patterns. Sometimes it fights with the calculated precision of a veteran space marine. Other times it charges into obviously suicidal situations with the reckless abandon of an Ork who's having too much fun to care about. Damage. This unpredictability makes it harder to counter as enemies can't rely on established tactical doctrines. The psychological impact on enemy forces is significant. Imperial troops might be particularly disturbed by the sight of what appears to be a Chaos Dreadnought fighting alongside Orks, covered in Orky modifications, but still radiating that sense of wrongness that all Chaos war machines possess. It's a violation of expected battle lines, a breakdown of the order that soldiers rely on to make sense of the endless conflicts of the 41st millennium. If even Chaos forces can be subverted by Orks, if even the servants of the Dark Gods aren't immune to being looted and repurposed, what does that say about the nature of the galaxy's conflicts? Chaos forces facing this hybrid monstrosity might experience their own crisis of understanding. Here is a war machine that should be their ally, a Berserker Dreadnought that clearly bears the marks of Khorne's favor, and yet it fights against them with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm. The pilot's screams, when they echo across the Vox channels, are a mixture of ornate battle cries and what sounds disturbingly like Ork war whoops. The weapons fire with both the precision of Chaos craftsmanship and the excessive dacha of Ork engineering. It's wrong on every theological level, a profanation of Chaos itself, and yet it's undeniably effective. The Dreadnought's performance in prolonged combat reveals another interesting characteristic. It doesn't seem to run out of enthusiasm or fury, even when the battle drags on longer than it should. Normally, a Berserker Dreadnought pilot's rage, while intense, can eventually be exhausted, leading to a state where the pilot needs to be withdrawn and allowed to recover. The Wage field seems to prevent this exhaustion, providing a constant source of psychic energy that keeps both the pilot and the machine going long past the point where they should have shut down from damage or fatigue. This endurance comes with a cost, though. The longer the Dreadnought fights, the more unstable it becomes. The competing psychic influences begin to cause system malfunctions. Weapons might fire when they shouldn't, or refuse to fire when commanded. The Dreadnought might suddenly change direction mid-charge, responding to some impulse from the pilot that overrides the Ork controller's input. In extreme cases, the accumulated psychic energy might cause visible manifestations: green fire that isn't entirely natural burning along the Dreadnought's chassis, or brass-colored lightning arcing between the spikes. Eventually, every battle ends. When the fighting is done, when the enemies are destroyed or routed, the Dreadnought stands amid the carnage, covered in blood and debris, its weapons still idling as if disappointed the violence has stopped. The Ork controller climbs down, perhaps shaking from the adrenaline of having ridden a barely controlled killing machine through an entire battle. The other Orks gather around to examine the Dreadnought, admiring the damage it inflicted and making plans for repairs and further modifications. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot experiences whatever passes for rest in their current state. The post-battle come-down, the fading of the combat high, is different now. There's still the familiar emptiness, the sense that no amount of killing will ever truly satisfy. But there's also something new, a kind of residual excitement, an echo of the WH field's enthusiasm that lingers even after the fighting stops. It's confusing and unwelcome, this feeling that violence can be enjoyed without needing to serve any higher purpose. But it's also undeniable. The Dreadnought is dragged back to the Ork base, where mech boys will examine it for damage and make whatever repairs they deem necessary. The pilot has no say in this process, no control over what happens to their metal body. They can only endure as Orks crawl over them, banging on armor with wrenches, and occasionally cutting into the chassis to access damaged components. It's a continuation of the violation that began with their capture, a reminder that they're no longer a warrior of chaos, but a piece of Ork equipment, valued for its functionality, but not respected for its identity. And yet, despite all of this, despite the degradation and the confusion and the horrific fusion of incompatible psychic energies, the pilot might find one small comfort. They're still fighting. For all that's been taken from them, for all that's been forced upon them, they're still doing what they were created to do. They're still killing, still spreading destruction, still expressing violence in its purest form. The theology might be confused, the purpose might be lost, but the fundamental act remains. That's perhaps the most tragic aspect of this entire scenario. The pilot has been reduced to their most basic function, stripped of context and meaning, turned into a tool for someone else's war. And in some dark corner of their fragmented consciousness, they might realize that this is exactly what they were all along, even before the Orks captured them. The only difference is that now the truth is impossible to ignore. Broader implications. What this means for the galaxy. The existence of an Ork-modified Berserker Dreadnought might seem like a localized problem, a single strange occurrence in a galaxy full of strange occurrences. But the implications of such a creation ripple outward in ways that affect multiple factions and raise disturbing questions about the nature of both chaos corruption and Ork psychic abilities. First, let's consider what this means for our understanding of chaos corruption. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years believing that chaos taint is permanent and irreversible, that once something or someone falls to the dark gods, they can never be truly reclaimed. Imperial doctrine mandates the complete destruction of anything touched by chaos, whether it's people, places, or objects. The existence of a chaos artifact that's been successfully repurposed by Orks challenges this fundamental assumption. Now, to be clear, the Berserker Dreadnought hasn't been purified or redeemed in any conventional sense. The chaos corruption is still there, still affecting the pilot and the machine. But it's been diluted, overshadowed, forced to share space with WH energy in ways that fundamentally change its expression. If this is possible, if chaos corruption can be competed with and modified by another form of psychic energy, what does that mean for the Imperium's total war against chaos? The implications are potentially huge. If the WH field can interfere with chaos corruption, could it be weaponized deliberately? Could the Imperium somehow harness Ork psychic energy as a counter to warp taint? The practical problems with this are enormous, not least because it would require the Imperium to work with Orks in some capacity, which is antithetical to Imperial doctrine. But the theoretical possibility exists, and that alone is disturbing to those who prefer their universe ordered into clear categories of pure and impure. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, the existence of Ork-modified chaos technology raises different questions. The Mechanicus already struggles to understand how Ork technology works at all, given that it violates numerous principles of engineering and physics. The fact that Ork modifications can be applied to chaos technology, which itself operates partly on warp-based principles that defy rational explanation, suggests that the WH field is more powerful and more versatile than previously understood. There have been recorded instances of tech priests trying to study captured Ork technology, only to find that it stops working properly when removed from the influence of the WH field. An Ork shooter that fires reliably in Ork hands might jam constantly when a human tries to use it. The conventional explanation is that the WH field is necessary for Ork technology to function. But if that field can also stabilize or modify Chaos technology, it suggests that the WH isn't just making primitive equipment work, it's actively altering reality in more profound ways. From a theological perspective, the existence of hybrid Ork Chaos war machines is deeply troubling for both Chaos worshippers and those who fight against them. Chaos theology is built on the idea of inevitable corruption, the certainty that all things eventually fall to the dark gods. Orks, by existing outside normal patterns of chaos corruption and being able to modify chaos artifacts, represent a hole in this theological framework. They're not immune to chaos in the way blanks or pariahs are. They're simply too dense and too focused on their own goals to pay attention to chaos's whispers. The fact that Orks can capture and repurpose the war machines of Khorne's followers might be particularly galling to Khornate forces. Khorne is the god of warfare, of honorable combat and worthy bloodshed. Orks represent something different. Warfare for its own sake. Violence stripped of any context beyond the joy of fighting. That Khornate war machines can be made to serve this philosophy, that the servants of the blood god can be reduced to tools for Orky violence, is a kind of blasphemy that Khorne himself might take notice of. We can imagine the response from Chaos warbands when they learn that one of their Berserker Dreadnoughts has been captured and modified by Orks. The initial reaction would be rage, certainly. Chaos Space Marines don't take well to being mocked, and the idea of their sacred war machines being painted red and covered in Ork glyphs would be seen as the ultimate insult. There would almost certainly be attempts to destroy or recapture the Dreadnought, to purge this profanation before it can spread. But these reclamation efforts face a unique challenge. They're not just fighting the Orks. They're fighting what their own war machine has become. The Dreadnought, even under Ork control, still has all the combat capability it possessed before, possibly enhanced by Ork modifications and the WH field. Destroying it means facing a foe that knows all the tactics of Chaos Space Marines because it used to be one of them, but that now fights with the unpredictability of Ork warfare. For the Orks themselves, the successful modification of a Berserker Dreadnought is proof of concept. If they can loot and repurpose something as complex and dangerous as a Chaos Dreadnought, what can't they loot? This might lead to Orks being more ambitious in their looting efforts, actively seeking out Chaos war machines to capture and convert. Imagine an Ork mech boy who develops a reputation for converting enemy Dreadnoughts, who collects them like some Orks collect fancy hats or particularly shiny bits of metal. This could lead to a new meta in Ork warfare, where certain warbands specialize in targeting and capturing specific types of enemy equipment. We might see the rise of Def Dread conversions that include components from multiple sources: Imperial Dreadnoughts, Chaos Hellbrutes, maybe even Eldar Wraithlords if the Orks get particularly lucky. Each capture and conversion would be celebrated as a major achievement, with the mech boys responsible gaining status and respect among their peers. The existence of these hybrid war machines also affects how other factions approach Orks in battle. Currently, most forces understand that anything left on the battlefield after an Ork victory will be looted. Commanders know to destroy sensitive equipment rather than let it fall into Ork hands. But how do you completely destroy a Dreadnought in the heat of battle? They're built to survive extreme punishment. A damaged Dreadnought that's mission killed might seem like an acceptable loss if the pilot is dead and the machine is disabled. But if the Orks can repair it and modify it despite seemingly catastrophic damage, then the calculation changes. This might lead to new doctrines. Imperial forces might prioritize the complete destruction of disabled Dreadnoughts, using heavy weapons to reduce them to molten slag rather than just disabling them. Chaos forces might implement some kind of scuttling protocol, a way to ensure that captured Dreadnoughts self-destruct rather than be taken intact. But in the chaos of battle, these precautions aren't always possible, and sometimes equipment falls into enemy hands, no matter what precautions are taken. There's also the question of what happens when multiple Ork-modified Chaos war machines exist simultaneously. If one warband successfully converts a Berserker Dreadnought, others will try to replicate that success. Eventually, you might have several of these hybrid monstrosities operating in the same region of space. What happens when they encounter each other? Do they recognize each other as kindred abominations, or does each see the other as just another enemy to fight? The WAG field effects might be amplified when multiple modified Chaos war machines are present. The field is already stronger when more Orks gather together. If those Orks are accompanied by war machines that channel both Ork psychic energy and Chaos corruption, the resulting psychic environment could become extremely volatile. Reality might start to break down in unusual ways, with neither Chaos nor WAG effects dominant, but both active and interacting unpredictably. From a narrative perspective, these hybrid war machines represent something new in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, evidence that the various factions' technologies and powers can be combined in ways that produce results, unlike anything that exists in the pure forms. The galaxy is full of conflicts between different philosophies and powers, but usually those conflicts result in one side winning and the other losing. Here, we have a scenario where neither side wins, but something new emerges from their collision. This has precedent in Warhammer lore. Orks have looted Imperial equipment before, most famously in the form of looted wagons that were once Leman Russ tanks or chimeras. But those were relatively straightforward mechanical conversions. This is different because it involves psychic energies that actively oppose each other, yet somehow coexist. It's the difference between painting a tank red and claiming it goes faster, and actually having a psychic field interact with warp corruption to produce new effects. The psychological impact on those who witness these hybrid war machines in action is worth considering. Imperial Guard troopers who see what appears to be a Chaos Dreadnought fighting alongside Orks might suffer severe confusion and morale damage. The clear categories they rely on, the certainty that Chaos and Xenos are separate threats, breaks down. Similarly, Space Marines who recognize one of their chapters lost dreadnoughts among Ork forces, covered in crude paint and spikes but still somehow functional, might question everything they thought they knew about the permanence of Chaos corruption. For those who study the warp and psychic phenomena, these hybrid war machines are both fascinating and terrifying. They demonstrate that the warp is more complex than simple Chaos corruption versus purity. There are other psychic forces at work in the galaxy, forces that can compete with and modify warp influence. The Orks, despite being generally dismissed as unsophisticated brutes, wield a form of psychic power that's fundamentally different from anything the Imperium or Chaos possesses. This might lead to new research directions, new attempts to understand the WAG field and how it works. Of course, such research is extremely dangerous, both because studying Orks often ends in death by Ork-related violence, and because investigating alternatives to approved Imperial psychic doctrine can easily be labeled heresy. But the potential rewards, the possibility of developing new defenses against Chaos or new weapons to use against the Imperium's enemies, might be too tempting for some to resist. Ultimately, the existence of Ork-modified Berserker Dreadnoughts is a reminder that the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy is vast and strange enough to accommodate outcomes that no one predicted or planned for. It's a universe where the most absurd scenarios can occur simply because the forces involved are too powerful and too chaotic to be completely controlled. And in that universe, sometimes a Berserker Dreadnought dedicated to Khorne ends up covered in red paint and spikes, operated by Orks, and fighting with a confusion of purpose that makes it more dangerous than it ever was in its pure form. Conclusion: the horror and the absurdity. As we reach the end of this deep dive into one of the most bizarre scenarios the Warhammer 40,000 universe can conjure, it's worth stepping back to appreciate what we've explored. We've taken a journey through the collision of two fundamentally incompatible forces: the focused, ritualistic violence of Khornate Chaos worship and the enthusiastic, purposeless violence of Ork culture. The result is something that shouldn't exist, that violates the theological assumptions of multiple factions, and that somehow works anyway because the galaxy is too vast and too strange to prevent such improbable combinations. The Berserker Dreadnought we've examined, captured by Orks, modified by mechboys, and transformed into a hybrid monstrosity that combines chaos corruption with WH40K energy, represents more than just an interesting what-if scenario. It's a window into the fundamental nature of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, a universe where horror and absurdity exist side by side, where tragedy and farce are often indistinguishable, and where the most terrible fates can befall those who thought they'd already experienced the worst the galaxy had to offer. Consider the pilot trapped inside this modified war machine. They began their story as a space marine, a warrior created to be humanity's finest defender. Through war and betrayal, they became a chaos space marine, dedicated to Khorne and living only for violence. Through grievous injury, they were interred in a dreadnought, denied even the mercy of death. And now, through the intervention of Orks, they've become something new and stranger, a consciousness trapped in a machine that serves two masters, Khorne's rage and the Ork love of a good fight. This descent, this series of transformations and degradations, is quintessentially grimdark. There's no redemption arc here, no moment where the pilot regains their humanity or finds peace. There's only the continuation of violence in new and increasingly alienated forms. The pilot has become less a person and more a function, a violence-generating mechanism that exists because the universe has a use for violence generators. And, yet, there's something almost darkly comedic about the scenario as well. The Orks approach the capture and modification of a Berserker Dreadnought with the same enthusiasm they'd apply to looting a truck or a tank. They don't understand the theological implications of what they're doing. They don't recognize the horror of the pilot's existence. They just see a big, stompy thing that needs more guns and a fresh coat of paint. This disconnect between the gravity of the situation and the Orks' casual approach to it creates a tonal whiplash that's characteristic of Warhammer 40,000 at its best. The modifications themselves, the addition of more weapons and spikes, and the application of paint in colors chosen for their psychic properties, are both practical from an Ork perspective and completely absurd from any other viewpoint. The idea that painting a Chaos Dreadnought red will make it go faster is ridiculous, until you remember that in this universe, belief has power, and if enough Orks believe something works, it actually does work. The WH40K field makes the absurd functional, which is either hilarious or terrifying, depending on your perspective. For those of us consuming Warhammer 40,000 as a setting for stories and games, scenarios like this highlight what makes the setting special. It's not just the endless grimdark, though that's certainly present. It's not just the over-the-top violence, though there's plenty of that too. It's the way the setting allows for impossible combinations, for events that defy the established order while still making sense within the setting's internal logic. An Ork-modified Berserker Dreadnought shouldn't exist, and yet we can trace a completely logical path from the initial premise to the final outcome. Orks capture things, that's established. They modify what they capture, that's also established. The WH40K field helps make their modifications work. That's how Ork technology functions. Chaos corruption can coexist with other psychic influences in unpredictable ways. That's consistent with what we know about the warp. Each step makes sense, but the cumulative result is something that no one would have predicted, and that challenges our understanding of how the universe works. This is important because it keeps the setting from becoming too predictable. In a universe as thoroughly documented as Warhammer 40,000, where we have detailed information about multiple factions and their capabilities, it's easy to fall into patterns of thinking where everything is categorized and understood. Orks loot Imperial equipment, sure, but chaos war machines occupied by tormented souls fused with demonic machinery? That's a different category entirely, except it's not, because orcs don't respect our categories, and the way Agfield doesn't care about our assumptions about what's possible. The scenario we've explored also serves as a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, suffering can always find new forms. The pilot trapped in the orc-modified Dreadnought thought they'd already experienced the worst fate possible: eternal existence as a chaos Dreadnought, forever denied the release of death. They were wrong. Things could get worse, and did, in ways they never imagined. This endless capacity for new forms of torment is part of what makes Warhammer 40,000 so compelling and so disturbing. At the same time, the survival of the pilot through all these transformations speaks to a kind of resilience that's almost admirable. They've been through the creation process of Space Marines, the fall to chaos, the trauma of being interred in a Dreadnought, the capture by Orks, and the modification of their mechanical body. Through all of this, some core of consciousness persists, still aware, still experiencing, still somehow existing. Whether this persistence is a blessing or a curse is debatable, but it's certainly testament to the durability of consciousness in this universe. For the Orks, this entire scenario is just another day in the life of a successful wag. They captured a big stompy thing, made it more orky, and now they get to use it to crump more enemies. The fact that they've created something theologically unprecedented and psychically unstable is completely irrelevant to them. This is both the beauty and the terror of Orks. They achieve remarkable things through a combination of instinct, enthusiasm, and complete disregard for why those things should be impossible. The broader implications we discussed, the effects on various factions, and the questions raised about the nature of chaos corruption and WH energy are important for understanding what this scenario means for the setting. But at the core, this is a story about what happens when unstoppable force meets immovable object, when Hornate rage meets orc enthusiasm, when the most carefully crafted instruments of war get repurposed by beings who understand war instinctively, but who have absolutely no respect for anyone else's approach to violence. In creating this scenario, we've explored some of the darkest and strangest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We've examined the nature of Chaos Dreadnoughts and the torment their pilots endure. We've delved into orc biology and psychic abilities. We've traced the process of orc looting and modification. We've considered the psychological impact of forced transformation and the collision of incompatible psychic energies. And through all of this, we've seen how the setting's various elements can combine in ways that are simultaneously horrifying and absurd. This is what makes Warhammer 40,000 such a rich setting for exploration and storytelling. It's not just that there's endless war, though that's the foundation everything else is built on. It's that the war is weird enough, varied enough, and unpredictable enough that new scenarios can emerge from the collision of its various factions and forces. An orc-modified Berserker, Dreadnought is just one possible outcome from the infinite combinations the setting allows. There are countless others waiting to be discovered. As we close this examination, imagine that Dreadnought standing on a battlefield somewhere in the galaxy, covered in orky modifications, radiating confused fury and enthusiastic violence in equal measure. Its pilot experiencing a form of existence that defies all attempts at categorization. It's a monument to the universe's capacity for creating new horrors, new absurdities, and new examples of why, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And that war is stranger than anyone could possibly imagine. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into what happens when orcs capture a Berserker Dreadnought, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Stories of Hammer for more explorations of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. There are countless more stories to tell, countless more scenarios to examine, and countless more ways that the galaxy can surprise us with its capacity for horror and absurdity. Until next time, remember, in a universe where anything is possible, the most improbable outcomes are just waiting to happen. The Emperor protects. Gork and Mork are watching. Horn cares not from whence the blood flows, and somewhere out there, a mech boy is eyeing another piece of enemy equipment and wondering how many more guns he can fit on it.